And if you like what you hear tonight, you can follow us at becomecgpro.com or in our Facebook group. And so tonight, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Paul Debevec. Paul should need no introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. Paul is, if you've been even remotely interested in computer graphics for the last 20 something years, Paul's helped to invent some of the more significant rendering techniques in computer graphics and is definitely an inspiration to me and many other people. If you've used a renderer anytime in the last 20 years, it would have included some of Paul's inventions. Paul is currently the Netflix's director of research for creative algorithms and technology, overseeing the R&D for visual effects and virtual production with computer vision, graphics, and machine learning. Very well known for his work with the light stage back from 2002, and his work's been used in many, well, probably all feature films, if we're honest, but specifically with light stage work and some of his inventions, really heavily involved in the Matrix and Benjamin Button and too many others to mention. So I will stop it there and say welcome, Paul. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks. It's great to be here, and thanks for putting this cool podcast together. I've enjoyed several of the episodes so far. You get cool folks on here.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, I appreciate you listening to it as well. Yeah, thank you. Uh, so, yeah, I'd love to start the conversation just by asking you about the early days and what whether there was some inspirations or kind of early experiences that inspired you to want to be involved in computer graphics and
Well,
film.
yeah, I mean, certainly. So I'm just old enough to have seen Star Wars when it was on its first theatrical run. I guess it technically came out when I was 5, and by the time I turned 6 and all my other friends had seen it, my parents said, "Okay, I guess you're old enough to see Star Wars." So I got to see the film. I guess I thought it was interesting. I was maybe a little young for that to really fully, enjoy everything. But maybe a year or two later on PBS, I saw a documentary about the making of Star Wars, and that really left an impression because I saw, these amazing, technicians and artists doing things with like model miniatures and stop motion animation and rotoscoping and blue screen compositing, and doing this, like just amazing artistic technical work in service of creating like, an amazing world somewhere else and making it seem to exist when it really didn't at all. It was just, like a story somebody had thought up. And that got me excited about all these kinds of things. And by the time I got to high school, and I did try shooting some stop motion animations and some claymation, and I put my Star Wars toys in front of things that I was trying to do mats and like composite them in. Um, I end up becoming like my high school yearbook photographer and for the newspaper photography. I developed lots of film, and that taught me a bit about working with dynamic range and exposure and lighting and such. But I was really lucky that you could start to get home computers around that time that could do not amazing computer graphics, but you could do some computer graphics with them. And I started playing around with trying to create images on the computer because that seemed like a good way to go too.
Fantastic. Well, um, was there something that made you realize or lean more towards the technical end or the aesthetic end? I know I've gone through this a lot myself, being interested in both and trying to kind of do both, I guess. How was that for you?
Yeah, that's been interesting. I remember that my favorite classes in school were always art and math, and I think I looked for ways to try to combine those things as much as possible. And there really are lots of just kind of pressures in our industry to basically like specialize in one um, or the other, because really the best motion pictures are made when every single person is like the best that they possibly can be at the specific thing that they're supposed to do, and so that kind of invites some specialization. But I really, have enjoyed doing both. Obviously, I'm definitely more in the technical side than the artistic side. But for a while, right after kind of in grad school and after grad school, I had a reasonable run of having kind of a paper at SIGGRAPH every year that would present some sort of new computer graphics technique, and a piece either in the art show or in the SIGGRAPH Electronic Theater that would basically kind of demonstrate that technique in a like attempted to be kind of creative way or artistic way in some way with some success at least. And then at some point, once I was managing a group, it got harder and harder. Like I was able to do that once a year with things like, the Campanile movie and Rendering with Natural Light, Fiat Lux. And then once I was managing a group at USC after grad school, it took like 4 years before I could make the next film come out, because it's just like focusing the attention on that. And I haven't really gotten to make a film. I got to make a VR experience at Google called Welcome to Light Fields. But it gets tough. So, I'm one of those people who sort of dreams of, getting back and making another creative piece again. Hopefully it'll be a good one.
I look forward to it. I've enjoyed all of the ones that you've made so far. I mean, going back to I did a computer science degree, and I remember Rendering with Natural Light and Fiat Lux coming out and kind of gawping at them and thinking, wow, this is amazing, and I want to do more of it. Honestly, inspired me to want to get into computer graphics as well. I remember you actually came to talk at my university in Bristol in the late 90s, back around the Matrix kind of time, and yeah, it was really inspiring. So yeah, great to be talking to you now all these years later. Can you tell us a little bit about let's go back to, say, the image-based lighting and HDR work that you've done. Can you tell us a bit about how the inspiration or where the ideas came from, like how they kind of started to form?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can kind of, sometimes these things really do stick in your memory, like where, an idea occurred for the first time. And, in terms of like the high dynamic range concept, that really did occur to me while I was developing film in the darkroom at the University High School, your yearbook experience. And it was actually when I was just training to become a junior photographer in my junior year, before I was the photo editor senior year. And they gave me some rolls of film to go shoot on my own camera. And I guess the expectation is I might have like shot my classmates and pictures of the school or something like that. I took them home, and then in my backyard at 2 a.m. I set off fireworks, and I shot long exposures of fireworks going off in my backyard. That's like the first thing that I decided I wanted pictures of. And I developed it. And I remember that watching the fireworks, I just saw these individual sparks flying out of the little, Roman candle or something there. And they looked like individual sparks. But then when I looked at the long exposure, they were these like long white streaks. It was black and white film. And actually there were black streaks on the negative, and they print into white streaks. And that the streaks, even though I knew that those little dots were only there for like a fraction of the exposure time of when the exposure was open, they were still fully saturating the film. It's like there's no way that the film could have obtained any more density than what it did, even though that little dot was like moving super fast. And so I realized that spark was too bright for the film to record. In fact, it was actually even 100 times too bright for the film to record, because that streak was clearly 100 times longer than it was wide. And then it dawned on me that these numbers on the shutter dial were like, that went to 1,000th of a second all the way to like 1 second. And those huge numbers, that actually did mean there's that amount of variation in light in the world, and that you really have to choose which part of it you want to capture when you're taking a picture. And so when I finally had access to digital cameras, and I got interested in actually trying to digitally simulate motion blur, it felt like I have to use, floating point numbers, not just, 0 to 255 black to white on the screen, but things that can go much brighter than the screen if I want to get the right result of what a streak would look like in motion blur. And I think it was the cover of the 1994 engineering yearbook summary at Berkeley, where I was able to, get some renderings of, I guess it was Brian Murtick's research of dynamic simulation, and they wanted to show it convincingly on the cover of the research summary. And I asked him, he asked if I could help him. I said, well, render out a bunch of images, but render the specular pass out separately. So I could take those specular highlights, multiply them by, a big number, get them to be above the white point of the display. And then when you average them all together from the sequence, then those little highlights could leave a streak, just like a real specular highlight might leave a streak. And that ended up there. And that kind of inspired me to start trying to take real photographs that covered the full dynamic range of a scene. And that was the SIGGRAPH 97 paper on high dynamic range photography, where you shoot these bracket exposures, put it together. And it was this image inside Stanford Memorial Church that I think really sold the technique, because I took a standard low dynamic range digital image. It was actually on film and then got scanned on photo CD. And I blurred that standard dynamic range image, and there's some super bright stained glass windows in there, but once it motion blurred, they kind of got muddy, because I had no idea of how bright that window really was and how much of a streak it should really leave when it was blurry. And I took the whole exposure series, assembled the image, got high dynamic range pixel values, blurred that, which left the bright streak, and then you have to clip it to display it in the paper. I actually sent it back through the film response curve, so I simulated the film curve that it originally had. And it looked very close to the photo that I took in Stanford Memorial Church, where I physically moved the camera, rotated on the tripod during the exposure when I generated real motion blur. And I showed that you can get the right answer to what a real scene would look like to a real camera in motion if you do high dynamic range photography. And that was, I think, the first thing that was like a film relevant use of high dynamic range imaging. Even if your display isn't high dynamic range, or your movie theater isn't high dynamic range, you can still get a much more compelling result. And that was some of the first uses of the people in movies who started using it, was to do convincing motion blur in scenes.
Oh, interesting. Right. And then after that, you saw it being adopted. What were some of the early adoptions of it, and how did it start to get into the film world?
Well, one of them, I guess it's in the Matrix sequels. There's a scene where, kind of like a digital version of Neo is flying through the city, and all of those buildings, the folks over there at Escape, they actually shot the images of those digital buildings for the photogrammetry in high dynamic range, mapped HDR images on the buildings. And then when those flew by, Neo flying around, it left those streaks. And that was something, Dan Paponi called out as, being inspired by the work that I'd shown at SIGGRAPH. I think the first time they used that was actually in Mission Impossible 2, with Tom Cruise jumping out of a building at night. And the buildings are like flying back as he's falling. And those left very convincing motion blur streak. So that's like exactly the intended purpose. So I was thrilled to see that. The thing that happened though then is that, just working with these images, at some point it dawned on me that essentially these high dynamic range images are a record of the light that was in the scene. And that if I could shoot a panorama in high dynamic range, so that none of the light sources clip, and some light sources get really bright, so you really have to shoot the shorter exposures for that I would have digitally recorded that light. And this could solve, a tricky problem in visual effects, is how do you light your CGI object to sit in the scene so that it looks like it's really there? So it looks like it's lit by the light that would have been on it if it were really there. And, there's ways of doing it without HDRI. You can kind of, trial and error, move light sources around, or try to write down where they came from. When I asked people how they did it, because I thought like Jurassic Park was a pretty cool film with those dinosaurs tromping around amongst the actors, and ILM did a nice job with the integration back in '93. But when I asked them, how they did it, it's like, well, we put a lot of artistic effort into getting this to look right. And,
Yeah.
I wanted to do it myself. I want to make my own movie that looked like I'd put CGI stuff into real scenes convincingly. And I didn't think I could go through that. And I thought, there's got to be an answer. There's got to be something that, like, with technology, with science, you can get the right answer to this. And once I realized I was capturing the light, then the next thing was to simulate it. And so I approached Greg Ward, who was the author of the Radiance kind of like global illumination ray tracing system. And he was in my environment at Berkeley because he was at like a Lawrence Berkeley Labs where they were using this to simulate lighting and architecture. And I asked him, hey, I've got these like high dynamic range images. I want to light some stuff. And I had studied how to write, ray tracers and such. And I was about to go and kind of like add this into my own ray tracing code at some point. And he said, you know what, if you do this and this, you should be able to do it in Radiance. And it turns out you could. And that totally like jump-started everything that, we did. And our movies of rendering with natural light and Fiat Lux were actually rendered in Radiance. And I think they're two of the only like, movies that were created using that. We had to find a way to like render on the render farm and get it to do anti-aliasing and all of that stuff. But we put that together, and it was great to be able to have that available for those films.
It's interesting you should say that, because the first 3D computer graphics that I ever did was in Radiance at university, and I had to model our lecture theatre in a text editor and reproduce it and do a comparison against a photograph. That was our assignment. It was Alan Chalmers at Bristol University set this assignment to compare a CG environment against a real photograph, and it was an old photograph taken on an old camera. It was quite hard to do, to type numbers into a text editor. People take for granted now you get a user interface with a viewport and things like that.
That's right. Like in rendering with natural light, all of the 3D modeling for those little stands and those spheres, that little arrangement of things on the pedestal, all that was modeled in Emacs, which is a text editor.
That's why I did it in. Yep.
And it was all procedural. I had like little sine waves going around to like swoop the things and such. But that's a fantastic assignment that Alan Chalmers gave you, because just as all of the things that you learn about what it takes to achieve reality when you actually try to achieve it, and that was very much the I think Cornell started that with the Cornell box, because the idea was not just to render a Cornell box, but there actually was a real Cornell box. I got to see it when I visited Cornell when Don Greenberg had an event there in 1999. And the box was still around from, I guess, 13 years before, from the 86 SIGGRAPH paper. And the idea is like they'd photograph the real box with, it's got a red wall and a white wall, and you can see the color bleed onto the floor and the ceiling in the back. And then generate the same image completely synthetically with a CGI model of the box and CGI simulation of the lighting, which they use radiosity for that. And then it's like, okay, this is clearly working now.
Amazing stuff. It must have been so exciting. And imagine finding that. What was that moment like when you realized that you'd found something new? You'd found a way to capture light and then use it back even more so. It must have been very exciting.
I can really remember sitting in my office, which was 545 Soda Hall at UC Berkeley, and it was a cool office and a cool time, because like my office mates around that time were Chris Bregler, Thomas Leung, Alyosha Efros, Serge Belangi, and Jian Boshi. And if you're in the computer vision community, you can look up any one of those folks and marvel at their citation count on stuff that they've done since then. Also, I think really just having, these were all Jitendra Malik's PhD students, and I stayed on as like a lingering postdoc for 3 years, not realizing at the time even how valuable that time would be. Like, I'm still able to spend all the time writing a lot of code, but still working with UC Berkeley students, and I don't have to technically manage anybody yet. It's like, I'm so glad I took that time. But with all that other brain power in the room, it just kind of elevates your level, because they're doing completely cool stuff over there. You want to be doing cool stuff, And I would see these renderings coming out of Radiance, and I'd put like the candlestick on the table with the little spheres and make my funny little arrangement. And then I light it, and then it just looks like a photo that I'd taken of these things. It was like this creative power that I can make things happen. And to impress the office mates was great. Something that's kind of interesting, if you look at the end of the SIGGRAPH 98 paper on image-based lighting, which I think is still one of the longest titled papers in SIGGRAPH history. It was called Rendering Synthetic Objects into Real Scenes, Bridging Traditional and Synthetic Graphics with Image-Based Rendering and High Dynamic Range Photography. I mean, I wish I just called it image-based lighting. But the 98 paper at the end, there's this little thing of dominoes falling down on what was my kitchen table at kind of like my shared house at Berkeley at the time. And I proudly went and I showed that to one of my mentors, a media artist named Michael Neymark, back at Interval Research Corporation. And Interval had funded some of my postdoc work there. And I was very proud to show him, I think I got this new technique. I put these things on here. It looks like it's relevant for, cool visual effects stuff. And he agreed that this is a good technique. Yes, I got one. Okay. But he also just like kind of very subtly said, yeah, I think you could probably do something a little more impressive with it. And that was my cue. That's where Fiat Lux came from. I went from
Right.
2-inch dominoes on that table to 8-meter monoliths going down the nave of St. Peter's Basilica. And that was inspired by, Michael suggesting, hey, there's got to be something better you can do with this. So I actually looked inside and said, like, is there a story I want to tell? Is there a feeling that I want to try to get out there? And, kind of this imagery of sort of like the conflict between science and the church kind of embodied with Galileo, it gave me something to do with it and some need in order to kind of create those visuals.
Well, it definitely worked. I think it's good advice. It definitely made it a beautiful film to watch, regardless of whether you're interested in computer graphics or not. And it's obviously had so much new technique in there, but it was a cool film. I think it was definitely not more than a tech demo. It was definitely a film that stood up in its own right. I'd love to ask you a little bit about the Campanile movie and how that came about.
Yeah, so the Campanile movie actually happened before all of the the image-based lighting and high dynamic range imaging. And the Campanile movie also kind of inspired high dynamic range imaging because I'd had to be very careful to photograph all of the all of the images of the Campanile and the environment in the same lighting. And I realized like the only way to really do that is under cloudy conditions. Because if it's like sunlit on one side and dark on the other side, then I'll have to change the exposure on the camera a lot. So I ended up shooting some of that material at like 6 a.m. before the sun came up just to get like flat lighting over everything. And I thought like, well, if I had HDR, I could just cover all of that. But the Campanile movie, really like the beginnings of that go back to a computer vision class that I took at the University of Michigan. So like when I was a sophomore, I was looking for classes to take and I saw computer vision. I had no idea what it was, but it sounded cool and sounded like it involved robots. And I signed up for it. It was technically a graduate level class, but I showed up as a sophomore. And they taught us how to do image segmentation and write a stereo algorithm and try to do some object identification. And when we had to write a stereo algorithm, we had like these two aerial photos of the United States Pentagon, like military building, and they were a stereo pair. So it was really cool. If you cross fuse them, you'd see the Pentagon in 3D. And the assignment was to solve for the 3D depth by basically figuring out which pixels here are which pixels there, by comparing pixel neighborhoods, if that's how you want to do it, and then get a depth map. And there was another image of like going down a hallway. And I realized that if you take the image, this is 1989, if you take that image and you project it onto the depth map and then view it from a different point of view, you've shifted the perspective of the scene. And you've kind of turned a 2D image into a 3D scene that you can kind of fly around. And that sounded super cool. So, you know, a little bit of playing around with this at Michigan for like a course assignment, which I did get full points on that assignment. It was good.
Hope so.
And then summer of 1991, I think I'd recently watched the Back to the Future sequels. And as we know, like at this point, the DeLorean's flying around all over the place. And I had gotten a hand-me-down car from my mom, which was a 1980 Chevette, which I kind of felt I wanted to believe was a lot like a DeLorean. But like if you could only just like change like the vertical scaling of it and just make it half as tall, like it would kind of be the same. It was the same color, it was silver and all that. I thought at least I could try to make it look like the car could fly around. That would be fun. And I had this summer job where there was like kind of like a delay in the contract. I had nothing to do for 2 weeks. And I had access to a video digitizer, a Windows PC, and a Linux computer, a Sun 380, like an IBM 386 PC and a Sun 380. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to make a 3D model of my car and I'm going to fly it across the screen. That's what I'm doing for the next 2 weeks. And so on June 14th, 1991, the day before my birthday, I was out parking my car next to a parking structure in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. I got help from my friend Ken Brownfield, who helped hold a green screen, which was actually a green blanket behind the car. And I took pictures of it from a bunch of different angles. I wrote an algorithm to derive the 3D shape of the car, like a polygonal model of the car from the photographs. And then the real thing that I want to do is that idea that I'd had at the University of Michigan back in 1989, which was project the images as texture maps onto the geometry. And that colored in all of the little polygons of the car so that when I flew it around, it didn't just look like a gray CGI model. It looked like my car with the chipped paint on the roof and the bent license plate. And you could read the numbers on the particular license plate. And this was like, you know, it was kind of like an early form of photogrammetry and image-based modeling and rendering for that. And so when I applied to graduate school, which would be the next summer, I wrote in my college or my grad school application, I want to fly around cities virtually. I want to make CGI models of buildings and cities and fly around them. That's what I want to do for my PhD thesis. And so I started working on that. And, you know, modeling whole buildings and cityscapes like requires like more advanced photogrammetry techniques. And I was lucky that my PhD advisor, just Malik, put me in touch with a postdoctoral researcher named C.J. Taylor, who had been working on reconstructing polyhedral models from line segments identified in photographs. And the software that we wrote called Facade was basically able to reconstruct polyhedral models of architectural scenes based on line segments that you observe. So kind of a twist on normal photogrammetry, which is based on points and you triangulate where the points are. This, you just have to find any part of a line of an architectural edge, and that becomes a constraint for the solve. And it solves for where the cameras were, so you can do the projective texture mapping. I came up with a technique called view-dependent texture mapping, so that if you photographed your building, you know, from a whole bunch of different directions, like some from the right, some from the front, some from the left, and then you virtually do like a virtual camera path across the building, it'll actually cross dissolve which images it uses as the projective texture maps based on where you're looking at it from. So if you're viewing it from the right virtually, it'll use a texture map that was shot from a similar angle from the right. And that makes a lot of stuff like view-dependent reflectance and any unmodeled 3D little protrusions or dips in the model kind of look a lot better if you do that. And that's actually essentially the same idea as a surface light field that we were able to get into our SIGGRAPH 96 paper, which was presented just moments before the two well-known papers on light fields were presented at SIGGRAPH in the first session then. And, reconstructed a couple of buildings, including the Berkeley Campanile, from a single photograph. That was actually kind of fun. I showed that with enough architectural constraints, you can build a full 3D model of a tower from a single photo that's pretty accurate because of all the symmetry. My old high school building, I guess out of a little bit of competitive juices, I reconstructed Stanford's Hoover Tower as well, because Berkeley and Stanford have a little bit of a rivalry, and they have this little problem. Their tower is only 278 feet tall, whereas the Berkeley Campanile is 307 feet tall. So, it seemed like they could use a little help anyway. But these examples were fun, and the paper got accepted to SIGGRAPH, which was exciting. I actually had a piece in the art show that year with a reconstruction of the Rouen Cathedral and projecting different time of day pictures on that in an interactive installation that I did with media artist Golan Levin, because we'd worked together under Michael Neymark at Interval Research Corporation. So that was a fun thing to play with back then. But then again, I kind of felt like, okay, well, how do we kick this up a notch? How do we turn it up to 11? And I had the sense that if you could see not only a single piece of architecture that you can turn around, but if you could see its environment as well, and fill up every single pixel of the screen with a photoreal view into some other world, and you could sense kind of the lighting consistency between that environment and that thinner piece of the environment, it would look really realistic. It would be cool. So we've got to model the environment, got to model the tower, and that was not quite the next thing I did. I finished the PhD thesis on, I think, December 19th, 1996, went home for Christmas break, came back on January 3rd. My advisor, Jitendra, said, hey, what about that high dynamic range imaging idea? Did you want to try to do something for SIGGRAPH with that? And I told him, sure, let's do it. So we wrote that paper in 9 days and submitted it on like January 12th. And then I slept for 3 days, and then, okay, let's make the Campanile movie. And we had 2 months basically to get that done by the submission deadline in early April. And I was very lucky to bring in kind of a team of Berkeley students. Jitendra gave me a new grad student that, was just a first year. And he said, okay, you can work with him for the first year and teach him a few things before I work with him for the PhD. And there was a master's student that we brought in, and a couple of undergrads, and we just tried to make that film happen. And this year happens to be the 25th anniversary of the Campanile movie at SIGGRAPH. So I've been looking through some of the old stuff for that, and it was a fun time of not really knowing what we were doing. But when we first got those renderings of the tower turning around with the background behind it, and it filled up the whole TV set. We actually field rendered it at 60 frames per second at the time, and we could render it in real time because we had a Silicon Graphics Reality Engine too, and we did all the real time stuff for that. That was just like tingles down your spine. I can't believe this is CGI. I can't believe it's not real. And scores of people from the computer science building would come in to the little graphics lab, which was 543 Soda Hall, and take a look at that spinning around on a Sony monitor, not unlike this one back here, just to see what that looked like. So I'm very happy that the SIGGRAPH Electronic Theater accepted that piece, and I remember being particularly pleased that it was like in the same show with the visual effects from the special edition of Star Wars when they revamped some of those, and our piece played just a couple of pieces side by side from that in the show.
Well, I think it deserved to be there for sure. Yeah, it's fascinating hearing about this as computer graphics history. Are you guys doing anything for the 25th anniversary?
I would say yes. Keep your eyes peeled. There will be some links posted in a little bit.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Maybe one of the bigger things that you've worked on, and you've worked on for quite a long time, is the light stage. Can you tell us what that is and how it works? and how that came about?
Yes, because actually some of the things that's been used for a lot aren't even what we originally were trying to do. So once, I'd done, work with image-based lighting and shown that you can, put CGI objects into your virtual scenes, and we use that for, rendering with natural light and fiat lux. I got the sense at some point that, if I'm going to continue my career as a filmmaker, I should probably make a movie that has people in it too, not just architecture and objects. And somehow the development was arrested at some point. But um, I realized I'm not going to be satisfied putting filming people on a green screen with just randoid studio lighting and trying to composite it in and sell people as if that person's really there. It looked too hard to do it. I was aware that a good cinematographer can make it work, but it didn't feel like a repeatable process that should have a technically correct answer to. And I knew that we were recording the light that maybe an actor would need if they were going to be inserted into a scene, but we didn't have a way of rendering a real human being in a global illumination algorithm with image-based lighting. So the question is, how do you turn this digital 360 image into a real 360 degrees of illumination on somebody? How do you light somebody with a reproduction of that real lighting environment? And that was the idea for the light stage. So, my first ideas for this is okay, we'll do it with a bunch of video projectors. We'll aim them onto different surfaces around the actor, and we'll display these images of the actor around. And I borrowed the department video projector to do some tests, down on the first floor of the computer science building. And it was kind of cool. I could see this light reflecting on my face that was like an image of the light. But then I just looked at the practicality of building, essentially like a 360 OmniMax theater on a student budget with enough video projectors for that. And it just didn't compute. And I also realized probably that we wouldn't be able to get enough contrast ratio. There'd be so much light bouncing around in the scene that, it would muddy itself up. And as a result, that wasn't the paper that I did for the follow-up to the image-based lighting paper. SIGGRAPH 99 was on inverse global illumination. But by the time it was ready to submit something to SIGGRAPH 2000, it's I still really wanted to show real people lit by image-based lighting. And I realized, okay, if I can't build this ideal omnidirectional display device of a light stage, I could at least simulate what it would do by photographing a person lit by one lighting direction at a time. We built this gantry where you spun a light source around somebody. And if they stayed still, you get this data set of them lit from every direction light can come from. And then using the superposition principle of light, you can add those images together, tinted and scaled according to the colors and intensities of light in the environment, so that it ends up looking like they're lit by the light of that environment. If you had a lot of if you're in the Grace Cathedral light probe, you've got a lot of orange light coming from here, you've got a lot of cool light from above, and you've got a lot of neutral light coming from the opposite side, from the nave. And it basically takes those images, lit from here, tints them orange, lit from here, keeps them neutral, lit from there, tints them blue, adds them all together. And now you've got the face lit by the light of Grace Cathedral because you've shot all those lighting passes of somebody. And that felt like a win. That, and then we did a new version with strobe lights for Light Stage 2 at USC. And turns out that's actually useful data if you want to relight a real actor. And eventually, if we figured out these polarized gradient lighting conditions that really reveal surface structure of skin pores and fine creases and give you tenth of a millimeter accurate photogrammetry. And that became something that, they would send all the actors to us from, Avatar and Maleficent and Blade Runner 2049, all the way up to Free Guy is the latest one, I think, that's come out for all that scanning. But really the original intent was we want real world image-based lighting, IBL, IRL, which I almost have a license plate that says. But what happened in actually in 2001, and this is work that got published in our SIGGRAPH 2002 paper on lighting reproduction, is that they came out with this little light source that had red, green, and blue LEDs in it, and it cost about $100. It was a Color Kinetics iColor MR light, and you could control it over USB, and it wasn't too complicated to program it. And so I wrote a grant proposal that we want to do image-based lighting on real people. We bought 156 of these lights. We built a sphere to plug them all into. And I worked with actually a summer intern, one of our greatest summer interns ever, Andreas Wenger from Brown University. He came over and he wrote the software to take a light probe image and in real time drive this omnidirectional display of LEDs to display images of this virtual environment to illuminate the actor with the lighting. In our SIGGRAPH 2002 paper, there's 4 examples in it, one of which is lighting, the actor with Grace Cathedral. One's lighting the actor with the rendering with natural light environment, the eucalyptus grove from Berkeley. One is in the Galleria degli Uffizi. It's kind of like that overcast strip of light between the buildings. And the final one used the 3D model from our Parthenon project movie, which was like a year into its 4-year production at the time. And we used that lit by Arnold to render a virtual light probe sequence going down the colonnade in the afternoon so that the actor would actually step into shadow and into sunlight and into shadow and into sunlight. And we'd composite them in. It was Alana Livna was our actress. So that when she's kind of walking in place and we'd composite her in, it should look like she's walking into sun and shadow as you go forward. And we rendered out virtual HDRI maps out of Arnold. We were using Arnold in 2001 because Marcos Fajardo, who wrote Arnold, was actually a member of our laboratory at the time. That was a fun moment. He'd started Arnold before, but then he contacted us and said, "Hey, got stuff to do in LA." And I said, "Yeah, sure, come on, be like a visiting researcher with us." So we got to use Arnold for a while, and during that time, we helped him implement the image-based lighting features, or at least like cross-check that he's doing it right and everything.
Is it true that it's named after Arnold Schwarzenegger?
That I believe that's true.
Right.
And I was actually technically Marcos reported to me at the time, and I feel like I might have failed as a manager at this point. But what the files are called if you have an Arnold scene source file is a .ass file. So that happened on my watch that it got named. I had suggested Arnold render file, which I thought was suitable because it would be an ARF file, and I got overruled by I think Marcos and then also X-Ray Halprin on my team at the time. So if you've ever had to deal with a .ass file, then that's where that's fully Marcos can own that one. But anyway, so we showed like Arnold renderings basically lighting somebody. So we showed both real environments from HDRIs and virtual environments from Arnold renderings basically being displayed as images on people. And I presented this work at SIGGRAPH 2002. It was in San Antonio. It was a really fun place to have SIGGRAPH. And a friend of mine, who's a visual effects supervisor named Johnny Banta, and helped with a little bit of the background research for the paper, he was in the audience. And afterwards, he told me that congrats, really good talk. And he said, and actually there were some really important people at your talk. And I said, "Oh, really? That's awesome. Hey, who was there?" He says, "Well, John Knoll from ILM was at your talk." And I said, "Oh my God, awesome. That's so great. John Knoll from ILM was at my talk." And then Johnny said, "Yeah, he didn't like it." Oh no. He said, "Yeah, he kind of threw up his hands and said, who needs it?"
Wow.
And at the time, John, I guess 2002, he just worked on probably Star Wars Episode 2 at that point, I think a lot. Or maybe certainly Episode 1, maybe Episode 2 he'd been working on. And, they had to get as good as anybody's ever gotten at filming actors on a green screen, lighting them so that they'll look right in the composites. And so, he had some authority to say that on. But, the magical thing is that, I mean, after we actually used this technique in production for movies like Spider-Man 3 and The Social Network and Gravity, that it started to look like this was going to be like, a useful enough thing. And he was one of the early adopters of scaling it up to full scale, virtual production stages. In particular, in his amazing work that he did for the film Rogue One, he got, a ton of LED panels to display images of the virtual scenes to be the lighting on the objects, and lit kind of like spaceship cockpit. So like he had a little mock-up of like, an X-Wing cockpit and a pilot in there. And just like we had played back the renderings, of the Parthenon and the changing lighting on Alana as she was going through, they played back the lighting that they'd rendered out from their renderers of space battles onto the virtual X-Wings. And, when this work came out, and I was on the Academy SciTech Council with that at the time, like he spoke very highly of it, about using these LED lights as, or things that you might have thought of as displays as light source, and doing image-based lighting on real actors and sets. And so that kind of helped, and now there's even more interest. I think we've lost count of how many virtual production stages there are out there.
There's a lot. There's a website that attempts to track how many of them there are. And it's the sea of dots. There's a lot of them, for sure. So this is played forwards into your work in virtual production. Is there anything that you can talk about in terms of what you're doing at the moment? Is it all completely super secret? Particularly with the Netflix stuff.
Yeah, there is some stuff to talk about, actually, and really, there's more than time that we probably have. But this basic idea of surrounding actors with LEDs to light them with images of virtual environments, that's 20 years old now, and we've continued working on it for 20 years. And there's a lot of research papers nobody's gotten to even using in production yet. Starting to, and that's exciting. I hope we'll be some of the people to do it. But one of the things that I noted even back 20 years ago in that paper is that the color rendition accuracy of these RGB LED lights is kind of poor. I showed at the end of that 2002 paper, like, this is the spectrum of an actual, like, an RGB LED source displaying quote unquote white. And it makes white by like a little spike of red spectrum, a little spike of green spectrum, a little spike of blue spectrum. It doesn't look like daylight spectrum. It's the same color as daylight, but it's not the same spectrum. So you can fool your eye that you're seeing the right color, but it doesn't light stuff right, because once it interacts with the spectrum of colorful shirts and also human skin, another spectrum we put in that paper is, here's the human skin spectrum, and we showed they kind of match up in a funny way. What really happens, like the first thing you might notice stepping onto a virtual production stage and you're lit by the LEDs there, is that you kind of look pink or reddish. You pick up extra red color. Dark skin tones pick up extra red. Light skin tones pick up extra red and a bit of extra blue and go a bit magenta. And this is something that you cannot fix by dialing the lighting back away from red on the stage, because then all your neutral tones are going to go cyan. It just cannot be fixed. The problem is that human skin keeps reflecting more and more light as you go toward the longer wavelengths, getting up into, where eventually you've got the near infrared. And that red LED on LED panels is chosen pretty deep into the reds for reasons of having a wider color gamut. So it looks like, red to our eye, but of all the reds they could have chosen, it's one that lights skin pretty funny because it really just glows us up. And we did quite a bit of work. Like 2003, we basically started building light sources, solid state light sources, out of multiple LEDs. We made like a 9-channel light, which is kind of, things that like RE Sky panels do, which have wonderful color rendition, do today. We did a paper on that in 2003, and we showed we can fix this color rendition issue. In 2016, I got to work with a PhD student named Chloe Legendre, who I'm working with at Netflix now. We had built a, one of these like, spherical VP stage light stages where all of the lights, instead of red, green, blue to display the images, we actually had red, green, blue, amber, cyan, and white, which fill in the gaps in the spectrum. And we showed that if you just know what a color chart looks like in your environment, in addition to the HDRI map, you can pretty straightforwardly solve for how to drive your LEDs, all 6 channels of them, to match both the colors that you see in the environment or that the camera would see, and also the color rendition intent of those lights. So things lit by it look the same as they would if they're lit by the real environment. And we got some side-by-sides of people in the real world and in the light stage, and they are so close with no color correction whatsoever that I actually had all the results backwards in my slides for about a year until Chloe told me I had it wrong and I had to fix it. So we've been very excited at the prospect of, virtual production stages. Like when I first started talking to LED panel folks about like, hey, you know what, we really need, can we get at least like the color white in your LED panel? Like, can we have red, green, blue, white? Like we showed in Chloe's PhD work, that'll solve most of the problem right there. It'd be nice to have the yellow and the cyan too. If we just get white, okay, we can make it livable. And they looked at me funny because if you add white, that's a color it can already make. It will not increase your color gamut whatsoever. And if you're trying to say that your panel is awesome because it has a wide color gamut, that's not going to help. In fact, panels that have a wider color gamut have worse color rendition. They light stuff funnier because they have to put the RGB LEDs further out in weird parts of the spectrum to do that. But it dramatically increases the color rendition. As it turns out, nowadays, I think we're not too far away from people releasing panels that will have that additional color, and it's probably going to be white. And we know how to drive it. We just hope that they'll let us drive it the way that, Chloe said to do it in 2016. But the paper that we're about to show at SIGGRAPH, which is actually the first paper of the DigiPro conference, which is co-located with SIGGRAPH, and it's on the Sunday before SIGGRAPH, I think on August 6th or 7th. Looks at the problem. It realizes, you know what? We have actually built a lot of these virtual production stages already, and they're all just RGB, and they all have serious issues with color rendition, which cause a lot of, color correction having to be done in the end. And we figured out a way to solve for optimal linear color correction matrices that basically fix most of the problem, even in the RGB world. And the thing is, what you have to do is what you photograph on the camera, you can't make it look right to the eye. It's still going to look weird when you're on set. And that's probably the biggest reason why we should still go and get these white LEDs into the panels so that people don't get driven nuts with the lobsterization of everybody. But what you can do is you can solve for a color correction matrix at the end that basically fixes it. The big thing that you need to do is you need to desaturate out red and do some other fixes. And that can be done with a color correction matrix, a linear color correction matrix that doesn't mess up linearity. The thing that you might worry about, though, is that if you've solved for this color correction matrix that you have to like either jam into your camera or post-process your footage with, is that now your hard-fought in-camera backgrounds that you've put effort into making, those look right, which you can do using, things that Epic Games has put out there on white papers and this, cool Open VP-Cal project that some colleagues at Netflix have worked on. You might be worried that it's going to mess those up because you're going to, you got your colors to look right in camera on your stage for the in-camera background, and now you're going to mess it up with a desaturation matrix. So the point of the paper is what you can do, because these are all matrices, you can invert that matrix and apply the inverse of that matrix to your in-camera pixels in the frustum, so that your frustum now looks like it has bad color rendition, just like everything else on your stage that's lit by the rest of the LEDs. And your content in your frustum has a bit too much red and a bit too much saturation, so that it looks consistent with the way people do, and it needs to be corrected too. So without having to separate foreground and background, you put it all through that post-correction matrix, and now everything kind of just works, and it's pretty close. It doesn't fix all the color rendition issues, but I think it fixes considerably more than half of them. Maybe even 3/4 of color rendition is kind of solved, and skin looks a heck of a lot better.
Fantastic. Well, I hope that they're listening to this in the panel making world and doing what needs to be done. It sounds like there's a lot. It's a big job to make color work in these volumes, and clearly there's a lot of popularity for them, and it's important work to be done. I wanted to ask you. I know we're getting close to time, but I wanted to ask you a little about light fields. Are you still actively working on anything to do with light fields? How is that whole conversation going?
Well, light fields was something that I got to work on at Google. It was super fun. I was happy we were able to do light field stills and light field video. I got to work with some incredibly talented engineers on that. And as it sounds like you're aware, we actually did, while I was at Google, get to release on Steam a nice demo called "Welcome to Light Fields," which was a chance to try to do something creative with the technology. Full story is really that at some point there was going to be a budget to actually make a kind of a film using that technology, and at some point that when Google kind of got out of VR, the budget got cut, and I ended up having to make that piece out of all of our test material. So we did the best that we could out of what we had laying around. So I hope people enjoyed that. We did get to the point of shooting some light field video with a rig that we demoed at the SIGGRAPH, whatever, Creative Applications Laboratory a couple years ago, called the Brutus rig. And it was made out of 24 Z cams, which were synchronized. And they had fisheye lenses. They looked out in different directions. And, just because priorities shifted around to Google, all the stuff has been sitting around in the can all this time, and it never got processed. And it's some great stuff. It was shot during COVID on the deck of my backyard. And I invited some of my favorite friends over, who are incredibly talented folks who play bagpipes or, do comedy acting or Chinese violin, and are artist in residence, to just basically be interviewed as a light field or perform in a light field, like 5 feet in front of the camera. It's all just been sitting in the can unprocessed. And there's been so many good research papers at SIGGRAPH since then. And since the light field video solutions that we proposed, that I think are ripe for application to this data. So I've been working with a USC student named Nathan Fairchild over the last couple of months to choose some clips from this material, transcode them, apply appropriate LUT and such, and then document it. And we're planning on releasing around SIGGRAPH the raw data of this 24 camera 4K video for researchers and whoever wants to play around with it, poke around with it, and see if they can turn it into an immersive VR 6 degree of freedom light field experience.
That's exciting. Well, I remember just getting glimpses of it, seeing the Litro camera, and just thinking like it was, no, this is the future. This is how we're going to be making everything. And then thinking about how much data it might produce, and it seems like it's still a work in progress, and hopefully it will continue.
Yeah, I would love to see if anyone wants to try to take what we published at Google for how to do it and kind of reduce the data into like multi-sphere layered depth images. That would be cool. But also new neural representations would be fantastic as well.
Right. What are you most excited about at the moment? What's the future look like for you?
I'm excited about seeing how filmmakers are going to be embracing this technology. We are ultimately the goal is to try to create tools for filmmakers, and every so often this beautiful marriage of art and technology comes together. I think Gravity was a really great example of that, with using like the lighting reproduction techniques, for rendering astronauts spinning out of control in space, and the lighting looks like it's doing the right thing. I think The Matrix was a beautiful example of using the techniques that we developed at Berkeley for photogrammetry and image-based rendering to create these virtual camera moves through scenes of this world in the Matrix. It just was like there's this wonderfully meta thing that like the Matrix was actually created using state-of-the-art kind of virtual reality technology to do the visual effects for that. And I think that with the advances that we're seeing and we're trying to help make too in virtual production, there's going to be some scenes and some visions that filmmakers will have that really take the technology to the next level creatively. And it won't be just like, well, we saved money from having to go out to the real desert and we just displayed the light from the desert in the studio, right? There's things ripe for the picking that maybe no one's quite seen yet that they're going to get, and it's going to blow everybody away, and it's going to be the next Matrix or the next Gravity. And I'm looking forward to seeing that, and fingers crossed I get to be part of it somehow.
I was going to ask if you want to make another movie. You said at the beginning. I'd love to see one.
I would love to do that. I'm inspired by, I mean, the other thing that I realized, another reason why I probably haven't made my own movie in a while, is that it's also incredibly satisfying to help somebody who's, a truly talented filmmaker make their movie, and
Right.
to feel that you contributed something to something that's just so much larger than yourself. Which we've gotten to do, several times to various degrees. I am inspired by like both, Tim Weber, the visual effects supervisor for Gravity, and Paul Franklin, that's like the founder of DNEG. They're both doing their own films now, and in some cases working with virtual production technology to do that. So I'm going to look and see how it works out for those guys. I think it's going okay so far, and maybe at some point I'll find an opportunity if that's a possibility.
It's really cool to see what the new generation are coming up with as well. I think with the fact that people now have access to what was hundreds or hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars worth of equipment a long time ago. Now people with a couple of $1,000s for a computer and a free piece of software with Unreal Engine, or some of the other technologies that are now available, Blender and Unreal, and with very little relative to where we were before, you can now make your own, and anybody can do it. I feel like it's time for another George Lucas to appear, or somebody not needing a huge budget to be able to be really creative with it.
I think that's great. I think that's so important for democratizing the technology and getting, kind of like the economic efficiencies out of that. The other thing that I'd want to add to it and also point out is that like all of the stuff that we did, where we managed to do something that was new and not done before. Part of why we got to do it is that like because the tools didn't exist yet, and just willing to deal with the pain of that. So when we made the Campanile movie, like digital movie cameras like were not accessible. Like this was 1997, and the Sony VX1000 came out that year, and the Firewire capture card to digitize the footage came out several months later. So I actually had to edit the first version of the Campanile movie out of the S video jack from the VX1000 because that was the only way to get the video out, and then I remastered it in actual DV when you could do Firewire. And when I look at the kind of work that made Star Wars possible, that made The Matrix possible, that made Gravity possible, it's folks who they had this creative vision. They realized maybe the technology can meet it there, but they really took technology that there wasn't any real solid reason to believe it was going to be able to be possible to do it, and they just made it happen anyway. And I'd encourage folks who really want to get on the map in terms of doing something that gets some attention and blows people away. It'll be something that the tools aren't just necessarily sitting right there under your drop down menu yet, and you're going to have to do you're going to have to bleed a little bit for it. And that's the fact that we do have so many of these things becoming standard processes. That's all a platform from which we can use to reach higher.
Right. Any advice to aspiring filmmakers, particularly technology based filmmakers? I don't know if that's the right word for it, but people interested in pushing this edge that you're describing. Do you have any advice for them how to go about it if they feel like they lack the resources or the community or?
I think, you need to have just some freaking resolve
Mhm.
for it. And I honestly think, being in your 20s can be a great time to find that resolve, because you're really not thinking about um, too many other constraints of life at that point, and you can really throw your whole energy into something, and you can be a bit infectious. Like, other people will kind of, help you, or they'll get out of your way, or they'll contribute, and this is the kind of thing that you should be doing. And you just have to really run with it. Not all attempts to combine technology and art, or new tech and new art, like, go amazingly well, unfortunately. And the worst thing is that you do something that's like neither good technology nor good art, and
Mm.
that's not the kind of stuff that gets remembered. If both of them are above threshold, if one of them is great and the other one's above threshold, then you're going to be remembered, right? Like, you need to have like either awesome tech with like pretty good creative application, or awesome new creative vision with pretty novel good tech. If you max out both of them, then my gosh, you're great. But either one of those, you're still gonna be taking the ball down the field in a big way. And I'm still actually trying to dissect how things went as well as they did for my little group I had at Berkeley in the '90s when we were making the films. Um, I just remember those months trying to create the SIGGRAPH electronic theater films. I'd wake up every morning early, kind of with the residual image of a train coming at me, which was like the deadline for when this film has to be done, and really having no actual plan of how to do it. Just knowing I'm going to get in there, I'm going to try to make as much progress as I can. I'm so lucky that I had Berkeley undergrads to help on these films that worked just as hard as I did in a lot of cases to make these things happen. And you know, getting to it, all of the films also like achieved maybe like 55 to 60% of the original vision of what we had. And so when we finally submitted the thing, I was like deflated for a day or two, because it's like, oh my God, like, did we even come up with anything good? It's like, we were going to do this, we were going to do this. It wasn't until like about 3 days later, when I'd gotten some sleep and taken a trip somewhere or something and watched the tape again, it's like, oh, actually, this might be kind of good. And you can kind of reevaluate it. So I encourage anyone else, try to go down that process, because I want to watch your film. I think it's going to be pretty cool.
Well, it sounds like there's some great advice mixed in there. I think clearly community is important, being around other smart people, having the right kind of environment to gestate these ideas, but also having the resolve and having the commitment to the idea, and dedicating yourself to it, having a deadline, not being able to get out of it and having to fix it, setting yourself big challenges. I think there's some fantastic advice. Paul, is there anything that you want to share with the world? Anything that you would like to highlight? Any place where people can follow you?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I've got a website, debevec.org. I think I'm Debeffects on Twitter. Scott Stockdike, who's the visual effects supervisor that we worked with on Spider-Man 2, was the guy who said, hey, Paul, you should get a Twitter account. And so I went and opened up Debevec. So I'll post links to papers and talks there. And I would say get yourself to SIGGRAPH, the SIGGRAPH conference. I got to go to my first SIGGRAPH in 1994, and it changed my life. It like, I saw the SIGGRAPH 94 electronic theater, and I still remember like getting to see the behind the scenes of how they made Forrest Gump, and just realizing like, wow, this is how I not only like, learn the secrets of what's behind stuff, but I can meet the people who do it. And there's a lot of information out there on the internet these days. There's a lot of stuff you can find online and learn online. That's all great. But there's no substitute for like actually going to the conference, sitting through the talks, making sure you get enough sleep so that your brain's in a position to absorb it the next morning. There's lots of things to do in the evenings, with receptions and stuff, but like get there, go to that first talk, go to all the talks during the day, and absorb and meet people. You'll just learn stuff that you'll never just randomly encounter online.
Right. And a good opportunity to meet other like-minded people and dig into the community aspect of it, because all of this stuff gets made by many of us that get together and collide our ideas together. And yeah, I want to go this year. I hope I can. I'm not sure that I can, but I love SIGGRAPH too. My first one, I remember falling asleep in the theater because I was so tired. I'd flown from England, and yeah, but amazing event. I'm a huge fan of it. Um, Congratulations on becoming the governor at the academy as well. That's it.
Yeah, amazing.
That sounds very cool.
Amazing position. I've gotten to be on the executive committee and the Academy SciTech Council for the most of the last decade, it's thrilling that the membership thought that I could help represent them within the academy and also with the industry. Visual effects professionals, they're responsible for more than half the box office of Hollywood at this point, and we need to recognize that and we need to honor that. And I think that's a great thing for the academy to be doing.
Well, thanks for contributing to it. And yeah, we could definitely, as an industry, use more help and representation for sure. And yeah, Paul, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. Been a real pleasure to get to talk to you. I feel like we could probably do another couple of episodes at least. So maybe we get to have you back one day. But
anytime.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, thank you again. And thanks also to our listeners for tuning in tonight. We had a lot of people tune in live, to anyone listening to the recording as well. Thanks for listening. And you'll catch us again in a couple of weeks for another episode. You can follow us at becomecgpro.com if you're interested in our school and classes, and our Facebook group as well. But thank you again. Good to see you, Paul, and we'll see you again soon, everybody out there.